Hello everyone, Tom Simmons coming to you today from Dungeon Dragon Farm in Chester, Vermont. You can see it's a beautiful spring day, so we only have a few feet of snow on the ground and there's still ice on the pond behind me. And we're doing this video outside today because the topic of today's lesson, externalities, has a direct impact on natural resources. And this topic of externalities is something that we could do an entire course about, because it's a very large topic, many different aspects to it, but we're just going to do a brief run through of what externalities are and how we can control them in the context of looking at microeconomics. So the first question we have to ask is, what are externalities? Well, if you think of the previous videos for this microeconomics class, you'll notice we spent a lot of time looking at producers and the costs they incur when they are producing a product, and how they need to make sure that they can set a price that's going to cover all of those costs, plus allow them enough of a profit to continue or expand their operation. Opposed to that are the consumers, of course, who are price conscious and who are looking for a price for a product that brings them enough value that they are willing to part with their hard-earned money in order to actually buy that product or that service from the producer. And basically we've looked at it as if it was a closed system, whereby the price is one that the consumers are willing to spring for, but is also able to cover the producer's costs. What, however, if some of those costs are actually borne by a third party? If someone who has absolutely no relationship to the producer or to the consumer who is buying the product is actually bearing the cost of production. This is the nature of externalities when the system is not closed. I'll give you an example. Very often when a producer manufactures, let's say, sweaters, such as the one that I'm wearing right now, before that sweater goes to the stores, it's very often treated with formaldehyde or some other dry cleaning material to make sure it's all clean and spiffy for the consumers to look at. Well, that cleaning fluid has to be disposed of somewhere. Now, in the best of all worlds, in a perfect world, the producer would bear the cost of actually processing the used dry cleaning fluids or the used formaldehyde and pay for the proper disposal. But what if instead they've got an outfall pipe that goes into a pond or a river, and what they're simply doing is flushing this used toxic material into the waterways? Well, in that case, the producer's not bearing any costs because it's not costing him anything to dispose of this fluid. And the consumer of the sweater is not bearing the cost of it because there's no cost for disposal built into the price. Who is bearing the cost for it? Well, everyone else. The fish in the river or the pond. The fishermen who normally would get their fish from that river or pond. The brew pub down the road that uses fresh spring mountain water to create their products. The homeowner who suddenly finds that their well has been contaminated. See, in this case, the total cost of production is not simply a mechanism between producer and consumer, but third parties who have absolutely nothing to do with the transaction are bearing that cost. That is an externality. Now, in the context of this lesson, we're going to be looking mostly at negative externalities, which is what I just described. But oddly enough, there are also occasions where there are positive externalities. I'll give you an example of that. Suppose I had a series of beehives on this property. I raise bees, I produce honey, and then I sell the honey on a roadside stand or in the stores to consumers. The negative externality would be if there was a school next to us, and every day students from that school were being stung by my bees. Or some of them needed EpiPen treatment because they were allergic. In that case, the school would be experiencing negative externalities from my operation, even though they are not part of that producer-consumer relationship. But on the other hand, if on the other side of my property, there's someone who owns an apple orchard, and because my bees are pollinating their trees, the owner of the orchard finds that her production is greater, and she's able to produce more, and she's able to sell more. She's actually benefited from my operation, even though she's not a part of it. So that would be a positive externality. But for the purposes of this lesson, let's focus on the problem. And the problem is the negative externality. And how do we deal with that? How do we make sure that the producer and the consumer of a good are bearing its cost? One of the most common approaches that is used is called command and control. And command and control is simply when government says, "Thou shalt not." You shall not dump your toxins into the water. You shall not puff your emissions from your factory into the air. And that is a very common political response to the problem of externalities. But the problems with that are many. First, just because government says you can't do something doesn't mean it's not going to happen. We see that happen all the time. But the second is very often these command and control rules come from higher up. They come from the federal government. They come from people who, though they may have the best of intentions, do not understand what's happening locally on the ground. And when it comes to natural resources and externalities, these are not theoretical damages. These are real damages that happen to real people in real specific places. And very often, the federal approach of command and control doesn't really take into account the differences on the local level. Example for you. A number of years ago, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the federal agency in charge of protecting the environment, discovered that in many places, municipalities were using dirty water to treat their sewage effluent, which you may think at first, well, why is that a problem? Sewage water is pretty dirty to begin with. But the problem was additional toxins and additional dirt was being added into the treatment water that was treating the effluent. So they came up with a rule, and they said every municipality across the board has to reduce the amount of dirt, of organic material, in their wastewater treatment inflow by 30%. And most people thought that that was an appropriate level, 30%. Well, the problem is that one size does not fit all. Never has, never will. And up in Anchorage, Alaska, they found it almost impossible to comply with the regulation. Why? Because the inflow water they used for their sewage treatment plant was glacier melt. And it was the purest water imaginable. In fact, their water that they were using coming into their sewer treatment plant was cleaner than what most sewage treatment plants were releasing after cleaning. But they were told by the EPA they had to reduce by 30%. And they responded that they couldn't do it because there was so few toxins in the water that to remove 30% of almost nothing would be an astronomical cost. Well, the EPA said that's the rule. So in our Anchorage, they began introducing fish guts from fish operations into the water so that they could then remove 30% of it and say they complied. That is a classic example of how command and control on a broad level simply doesn't work in every locality. Now, the opposite of that would be a locally imposed command and control for a local condition. Best example I can give you is happening right now on the road outside our farm here. As everyone knows, in New England, comes springtime, the snow is melting, it's raining, and what happens to your dirt roads? They turn into a mess. It's mud season. And so many municipalities in New England and in other places will enact a provision, a command and control provision, that prevents logging trucks from logging, let's say during the months of March through April. And the reason for that, again, is to control externalities. Because I may want to sell my trees to someone, and he may wish to cut them down and buy them and carry them out, but there's going to be an externality. And that externality is the wear and tear and destruction of the dirt road in front of our house because of the local conditions. So that's command and control. A second possibility that many economists have suggested for some of these big externality issues are simply to use economic incentives. But because they are created by economists, they're very often not understood in a political context. Best example I can give to you of that are transferable pollution rights. And if that sounds like you're saying someone has a right to pollute, I'm saying yes. Here's how a transferable pollution program would work, and let's use air pollution this time. You've got 10 different factories all producing some goods, and they are emitting noxious fumes into the air. They're dirtying the air. We don't want dirty air. That's an externality. So in a pollution rights program, the government would say, this is the level of pollutants each factory may emit, because you're always going to have some emissions. 100% purity is simply not an option. So they set a limit. If you are under the limit, good for you. If you are above that limit, it is up to you to decide what is the most cost-effective and efficient way to reduce your impact. It could be that you get what are called scrubbers, which clean the interior of your smokestacks. It could be that you change your operation. It could be that you change the raw materials that you're using so that they are producing a cleaner emission. Or, if none of these are immediately doable or reasonable in the short term, you can buy the right to pollute from someone who is already polluting under the level. So let's pretend the government establishes a level of 5 parts per million of a pollutant, and you're producing 6. Well, maybe someone else is producing 4. You have the right to pay them for the pollution that they are not polluting. And very often the knee-jerk reaction is, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you let someone pollute? Why would you give them the right to pollute? Well, one, because it enables them to do what is most cost-effective for that business. So you're not putting them out of business. You're giving them options. 2, you're actually creating a situation where the worst polluters actually have to pay those who are not polluting, those who are responsible. So the more responsible company now has a competitive advantage for doing good. And 3, it gives every company an incentive to have a level of emissions under the limit so that they can sell to others. And then what you do is you set a schedule, and over the years, that limit, whether it's 5 parts per million or whatever, lowers a little bit every year. So there is a constant pressure on businesses to come under those limits. And the entire process is one whereby you are rewarding those who are not creating externalities or creating fewer externalities, and squeezing those who are and forcing them into the regimen. That's a possibility. Those are transferable pollution rights. Now, another way of approaching this is to strengthen property rights. Example of this. Back in 1968, a a writer named Garrett Hardin wrote a famous essay called The Tragedy of the Commons. And what that essay was, it was a wake-up call for environmental activism. And what that essay detailed was the idea that when no one owns something, everyone races in to take it. An example could be the fish in the ocean. No one owns the fish in the ocean, so there's nothing to stop fishermen from running out and getting the biggest possible catch, because the bigger catch they get, the more money they make in the market. The problem, of course, is that fishing stocks were collapsing because of overfishing. Another example would be the buffalo on the Great Plains. During the 1800s, the United States was covered in buffalo across the entire Midwest out to the Rocky Mountains. They almost went extinct. Why? Because no one owned them. The idea was get as many as you can and make as big a buck as you can. So there's a few theories to deal with how do you deal with the commons, or the tragedy of the commons. One was developed by an economist named Ronald Coase, who developed what's called the Coase theorem. And he, in essence, said the problem here is ownership. There is no ownership. When people or institutions own something, they take care of it. And the contrast he gave was between the buffalo, who were almost completely exterminated, and cattle. No one's ever thought of cattle going extinct. Why? Well, because ranchers own them. They produce more. They manage them. If someone comes to rustle their cattle, they take action against them. There's legal action and there's private action that were taken against cattle rustlers. By owning the resource, by making sure someone has ownership of the resource, you can almost guarantee that there's going to be proper management and protection of that resource so that it continues to go on. Now, another economist named Elinor Ostrom, who I admit is probably my favorite economist, she just recently died. She developed that a little bit in her work governing the commons. How do you make this work? How do you take a pond where 30 people are living around the pond and make sure it's not destroyed? Well, her approach was to take Coase's idea of privatization, private property ownership, and to apply it to a community. In other words, she would say the 30 people living around that pond, they have the most important stake in what goes on in that pond. They have a vested interest in protecting its water quality, your ability to swim in it, your ability to fish in it, the ability of loons to nest in it, and nature to be present. So you give property rights to those owners around the pond. The government says, yes, you have the right to decide on the rules and the regulations and to control what goes on. Pond associations all over the country, and again especially in New England, have exactly this, where people who live around a pond may be paying dues into that association. They decide how that pond is treated, what boats can go in or out, what the fishing limits might be. By giving rights, management rights, with authority, to those who actually have the most interest in the resource. Her studies, which won a Nobel Prize, showed that around the world, these are the most economically effective and efficient ways to protect natural resources. Now, in many of these examples that I've given you, we've looked at the producer as the bad guy. The sweater manufacturer who dumps toxic dry cleaning fluid into the river, for example. But let me tell you, consumers can just as much be part of the problem and the equation of externalities as producers. classic example, and it's a very hot topic right now, plastic. You go to the supermarket, you pay them, they put your goods in plastic bags, you bring them home. Where do those plastic bags end up? Well, generally, they end up in the oceans. They end up polluting the waterways, and there's been a number of recent news reports of whales that have died with pounds and pounds of plastic in their belly. I do a beach cleanup on Lake Champlain. I've also done them on Fire Island. You fill bags full of plastic straws and cans, soda cans, and mylar balloons, and all sorts of non-biodegradable products that consumers have released into the environment. And so, again, drawing on something we've already discussed, a lot of municipalities are looking at a command and control approach. Thou shalt not use plastic, or thou shalt not have plastic bags. And it causes a lot of controversy, as it often does. Another way that consumers actually create externalities is evidenced by your car driving. You go to the gas station, you fill up your tank, you pay them for your gas, and then you go off tooling around doing what you normally do. But the fact is that you, by driving that car around, you are tearing up the roads. You are impacting the roads. You are creating externalities. Your use of that product is placing a cost on society or on others. So another approach to that kind of externality is the gasoline tax. Now, in a perfect economist's world, the gasoline tax that you pay would be used exclusively for fixing and maintaining roads. Excuse me. Because in that way, the true cost of the product and what it does to everyone else is being borne by you, the consumer of the product. Since you are creating the problem or imposing the cost on society by driving your car on the road, you are picking up the cost of doing so. And car registrations and gas taxes are both designed with that in mind. Now, in the perfect world, as I said, to an economist, that money would be used exclusively for road maintenance. In the real political world, unfortunately, very often that money simply gets dumped into the state's treasury, and they use it maybe for transportation, but maybe for many other things as well. Problem here, and this harkens back to something that we've looked at earlier in our course, is the problem of elasticity. Now, if you remember, when we discussed elasticity, we looked at the idea that there are some products that are inelastic, meaning that if the price of the good goes up, consumers tend to buy the same amount anyway. Gasoline was one of those. So the imposition of a gas tax probably does not reduce or change the wear and tear on the roads, because you're probably buying about the same amount of gas and driving the same amount of miles. In other words, it's not eliminating the externality. What it is doing is recouping the cost that you are imposing on society if that money is used to fix the roads. Another place where consumers are actually the ones creating the externalities, it can be examined by looking at traffic jams, staying with the car theme. And this harkens back to all the times we have looked at how consumers make choices based on whether or not the marginal benefits of the next action exceed the marginal cost of the next action. So it's 4 o'clock in Boston, and everyone is jumping in their cars and getting ready to leave their offices or leave the parking garages they're in and head home on the Southeast Expressway. And if you've ever been in Boston at about 4 o'clock on the Southeast Expressway, you can envision the picture I have in mind of multiple lanes of traffic, stop, go, stop, go, stop, go, not much action taking place. The problem with consumers is that, or you and me, is that they use marginal analysis in a way that only asks, how does it affect me? If I'm leaving my office at 4 and I have to make a decision, should I jump in my car and get in the highway and be involved in the stop and go traffic? Or should I walk down to the pub? Or should I do some shopping first and wait till it clears up? I'm generally saying, what are the benefits to me leaving now versus the costs to me leaving now? And you as a consumer may decide that the benefits exceed the costs of leaving now. Because even though it's a pain in the neck, you want to really get home and you have things to do when you get home, so you might as well start. You're not asking, how does your action impact other people? You're not asking, how will the additional emissions caused by your car affect the people living in the apartments alongside the highway? You're not wondering about how your actions might affect delivery trucks or emergency vehicles who need to use that stretch of roadway. You're essentially saying, how does it affect me? Well, when you say, how does it affect me, that means there's probably going to be costs that are going to be borne by someone else, such as the residents or the delivery drivers or the emergency responders that I've just referred to. And so one way to use an economic incentive or disincentive to make you think about that impact would be something called congestion pricing. And this is something that the city of New York is currently considering. It comes up every year. It's very controversial, although it has been implemented in places like London and Stockholm and Milan, Italy. And what that essentially says is, if you want to take your car into the center city at the height of traffic, you're going to pay an $11 tax or an $11 fee on top of whatever tolls may exist. And this is called congestion pricing. The idea is, by adding to the traffic jam, you are creating externalities. And this is the value of, or the cost of the externality that you are creating. And by doing so, if you want to do it, go right ahead, but you're going to pay the cost for it. On the other hand, if you're driving every day into the city, that becomes a real disincentive to be paying all that additional money, and you may opt for more cost-effective options for you, such as carpooling, or taking mass transit, or finding some other way to get to work, or using flexible hours where you use different times going to or coming from work. So these are all different approaches that have been used by national and local governments here and around the world to try and contain and control this problem of externalities. Because so much of what we have talked about in economics relies on the notion of a closed system where the producer and the consumer are making the decision, and the price is going to decide whether the consumer buys it and whether the producer makes a profit. But the reality is these transactions may have impacts on many other people, on many other resources, and impose a cost on others. And the art and the science here is how to ensure that producers and consumers bear the total cost of the impact of the transaction that they've entered into. This has been Tom Simmons giving you a very brief overview of a very big subject, and I frankly hope it's one you'd be willing to study more as you continue your studies. Thank you.